Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation. My name is Michaela, and for the past couple of years, I've been a student docent at the Pan American Unity Mural, which currently is housed at City College of San Francisco. Normally, my job entails telling people about the mural when they come to visit, but as you may know, it's going to be on loan to SF MoMA for a couple of years. Plus, this is an online course anyway, so we're going to do things differently. And if you've ever been to the mural live, you know that it's huge. It's about 74 feet wide and 22 feet high, with several different scenes and characters and just a whole lot going on. So we're going to take a more focused look at this mural, and that's going to be Diego Rivera's use of the feminine archetype to communicate his vision of Pan-American unity. And Pan-American unity is just this idea that all of America, meaning the continent of America, should have some sense of shared identity, cohesion, and culture. And the next slide will talk more about that theme and put some structure on this presentation. But first, I just want to alert you to a very useful website, Rivera'S.org, which is the source for all of the images of the mural I'm using in this presentation. It's a really great way to learn about the mural. There's like a ton of information on there, and there's even a key where you can click on parts of the mural and get little descriptions. So I would definitely recommend checking it out. We're going to look at certain characters and images within the mural, but try and cover the breadth of the whole thing. As I mentioned, focusing on the theme of the female archetypes. Specifically, we'll focus on the central and most important image, which is that of the great Mexica goddess Coatlicue. We'll also look at the modern American girl trope of the early 20th century and compare it to a reimagining of the Mexican mestiza/indigenous woman of the same era. Finally, we'll take a look at some of the real women in the mural, such as Frida Kahlo, Paulette Goddard, and Helen Krillinkovich. But first, what even is an archetype? Well, very generally, an archetype is an image, symbol, motif, or character that shows up across cultures and throughout history. We talk about archetypes in many different disciplines: mythology, literature, obviously art, and even psychiatry. In the early 20th century, psychiatrist Carl Jung famously posited that these images manifested from what he called the collective unconscious, that mankind shared some hardwiring that caused our minds to create and understand these common symbols. Rivera uses several symbols and icons based on women and the female body to communicate or advertise his vision of Pan-American unity, that coming together of the North and of the South of the continent. And I think it now might be a good time to back up and just look at the mural more generally so we can understand his main message. This mural was created in 1940 as part of the 1939-1940 World's Fair. That's the one that was on Treasure Island. It was painted live so that the people who were visiting the fair could actually see the process of making a fresco, and it was always going to come to City College once the fair closed. This mural actually has two names. I've been using one, Pan American Unity, but the longer title is The Marriage of the Artistic Expression of the North and of the South on this continent. And this longer title really lays out what this mural is about and gives a structure to the mural itself. You can see the right side of the mural, the north of the continent, is represented. It's the US predominantly, with a focus on California in particular. And then the left of the mural is the south of the continent, mostly Mexico with a little bit of Central America. And each side brings various gifts to this union, and they meet in the middle, merging into a bigger, better, stronger whole in the figure of this dualistic goddess, Coatlicue. Rivera was fascinated with machines and new technologies, and he believed these were the greatest contributions of the North. We have here a panel of inventors, which includes Samuel Morse, who invented Morse code, Robert Fulton, who invented the steamship, and Henry Ford with his V8 engine. This panel here has several scenes from The Great Dictator, a film of the era, and deals with cinema as well as the coming World War. Rivera said that films were like moving murals. We also have the railway, which connected the east and west coasts of the United States, and the development of gold mining from simple pan mining up to hydraulic mining. 1940 was the end of the New Deal era, so Rivera also has added many of these major infrastructure projects the U.S. government had invested in. We have here the world's longest conveyor belt, which was used in the building of the Shasta Dam, which is the part of that process is there. We have Treasure Island, of course, which was going to be an airport. And then, of course, our two bridges, the Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge. The fair was actually to celebrate the opening of these two bridges in 1936 and 37, but they also act as a metaphorical bridge between the North and the South, these two cultures. And then all of this modernity and technology of the North is then incorporated into the goddess by morphing part of her into this machine. On the other side, the gifts that the South brings to the Union are a spiritual understanding of the world, a rich creative tradition, and this idea that the history of this land started with the indigenous peoples. This is, of course, represented by Coatlicue in her current or standard form, she of the serpent skirt, but also the male god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who's being carved here by the artist Mardonio Magana and his apprentice. You'll see that the feathers of the plumed serpent, which are rainbow to denote the different fractions of light, originate in this temple here. Then you have all these people involved in all kinds of arts and crafts. We have these carvers and sculptors. This person here is actually working on a feather mosaic, which was an art form in pre-conquest Mexico. This weaver here, we'll talk about a little bit later. And then down here, mirroring that panel of inventors, we have Nezahualcóyotl, who was the king of Texcoco, a poet and an inventor. Rivera has him here with a possible flying machine. And then this panel here also mirrors the one on the other side. This time we have Pan American national heroes, Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln, holding hands or shaking hands with Simón Bolívar, the liberator of South America, and then Morelos and Hidalgo, who are both from the Mexican independence movement, and then the contemporary crafts of the era. So we got another sculptress here, paper mache, this tinsmithing person. And in that, you also have this self-portrait of Rivera doing a fresco within a fresco. And he isn't just hyping himself with this panel. He's one of what's known as the big three of the Mexican muralist movement, along with Jose Clemente Orozco and David Alfaro Siqueiros. And it really is thanks to them that murals as an art form were rediscovered around the world. After the Mexican Revolution, which lasted from 1910 to 1920, the Mexican government wanted to change the role of art and artists in society. They wanted new art that would be for the people and serve a positive and even educational social function. So they heavily invested in public art, and murals served as the best vehicle to communicate their new revolutionary ideals. Then, during the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt adopted this idea too and incorporated muralism into his New Deal program, though without Mexico's overtly communist messaging. The murals at Coit Tower were part of this New Deal public art project, as was this, the Pan American Unity mural. You might want to stop here and just pause and zoom to see more details within the mural and kind of get an idea for the layout. And in the next slide, we'll take a closer look at the central panel. And this is where it all comes together. The center is focused on Rivera's reinterpretation of the Aztec goddess Coatlicue. And just a note on the term Aztec, I realize that Mexica is more correct, but Aztec is just used so much more frequently and is better understood. So in the interest of accessibility, I've decided to keep using it, though I kind of go back and forth. Anyway, Coatlicue, with her hand raised in benediction and half transformed into a massive machine, is a modern goddess. The name Coatlicue literally translates to serpent's skirt, or she of the serpent skirt. And the jade calluses on her palm denote the sacredness of physical work and mark her as a creatrix of life and of earth. Coatlicue to the Aztecs was an earth goddess and the goddess of life, death, and regeneration. And so to early Mexicans, she already embodied duality. But in modernizing her with the machine, Rivera is expanding on that definition to include all the dualities that permeate his mural. That marriage of the North and South, ancient and modern, machine and sculpture, spirituality and science. And remember that she's over 20 feet tall, so you can imagine what an imposing figure she is when you see her live. There are also several other figures meeting in this place that I want to quickly point out. We have the City College mascot, the mountain ram here, being carved by the artist and engineer Dudley Carter. This is him, and this is him, and this is him here, all with the axe. And then we have the architect of our school, of the science building at least, Timothy Pfluger. He's also the one that organized this mural. And then we have this scene here with the actress Paulette Goddard planting the tree of life with Rivera here, another self-portrait. And then this almost life-size portrait of Frida Kahlo. But for now, let's just continue the exploration of Coatlicue and how she represents a unique interpretation of the feminine archetype. I mentioned the psychiatrist Carl Jung and his work with archetypes. Here we have a quote describing the mother archetype, which according to him and other scholars is one of the most important, being that all of us, when first alive, experience the world through our mothers. I won't read it, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the range of people, symbols, and ideas that can evoke the mother archetype. This is only half the quote, and in the next slide, we'll read the other half and see how it goes from specific and relatable to one's immediate surroundings into something more general and metaphysical. The image here is one of the most common and easily understood images of the Great Mother, the Madonna and Child. Of course, the mother and child is not unique to Christianity, but I just wanted to point out how this imagery can be morphed or specified for a particular culture. In the US and Europe, for instance, the blonde, blue-eyed Jesus is the norm despite his origins in the Middle East. Okay, on to the rest of the quote. Jung also put forth this idea of the duality of the great mother and the terrible mother. Here's a great example of the terrible mother, the evil stepmother, Maleficent, from Disney's Sleeping Beauty. So even if this was your first time hearing the word archetype, you would most likely recognize the tropes and patterns. They're used all the time. One of the main bases for Judeo-Christian philosophies is this battle between good and evil. So in Western art and mythology, we often see dueling opposites. But in many pre-Christian traditions, including Aztec mythology, this duality is often embodied in a single being. Examples would be the Hindu goddess Kali, or of course, our central figure, Coatlicue. Here we have examples of two more goddesses who, like Coatlicue, embody the duality of the great and the terrible mother. On the left, we have the Hindu goddess Kali, who is a fearsome destroyer of evil. She's a very complicated goddess who represents a lot of seemingly contradictory things, such as time, destruction, and also protective motherhood. Here she's portrayed in a very common form on the battlefield after battling demons whose severed head she wears as a necklace. She is usually represented in dark tones such as indigo, black, and deep purples, which relates her to the dawn of time and the primordial blackness that existed before the world was created. Her origin story is varied and there's lots of different versions, but usually the theme is that she is the darker alter ego of other nicer, more beautiful, more approachable goddesses of the Hindu religion. And then on the right, we have a sketch of a carving found in an old Babylonian temple, probably of the goddess Tiamat, who is associated with the primordial salty sea from which all life originated. She's also the mother of the Babylonian pantheon. Later, she battles her children, the gods who she created, and is defeated by the storm god Marduk. He then dismembers her body, and different parts of that body become the sky, the rivers, and the earth. The similarities to the myth of Coatlicue are remarkable, and they even share the same taloned feet. Coatlicue also battles her children, and her dismembered body was also used to create the earth. The myth goes that she was sweeping a shrine at the peak of Mount Coatepec when a ball of feathers falls from the sky and lands on her apron. She then magically becomes pregnant with the Aztec sun god Huitzilopochtli. However, upon hearing of her pregnancy, Coatlicue's daughter, the moon goddess Coyolxauhqui, becomes enraged and leads her 400 brothers and sisters, who represent the stars, in a plot to kill their mother. Amazingly, Huitzilopochtli emerges from his mother fully grown and in full armor and is able to defeat his siblings. In some versions, he's born normally and saves his mother just in the nick of time, and in others, he emerges from her already severed head. We'll see that the later version is the one supported by a basalt sculpture that was the basis for the Coatlicue in our mural. The sculpture we met in the last slide is the largest, most intact, and well-known representation of Coatlicue, and it's the inspiration for the left side of Rivera'S interpretation, though there have been some changes, such as the raised hand. The right side veers totally off the original, and is based off of an earlier work by Rivera. In 1932, he traveled to Detroit to do a series of murals for the Detroit Institute of Arts, which naturally were heavily influenced by the local auto industry. He painted this motor stamping machine and immediately remarked how the silhouette reminded him of Coatlicue's. He called it the serpent-fanged machine. So when he comes to San Francisco about 8 years later, this image had already been ruminating in his mind for some time. The sculpture on the left is a 9-foot, 3-ton basalt piece found in Mexico City right around the time of Mexican independence. And it has an interesting story just as an object all by itself. And in the next slide, we'll unpack the symbolism of this particular sculpture. So who is this goddess? She of the serpent skirt or serpent's her skirt. As I mentioned, she's the goddess of life, death, and regeneration, and is associated with war as the mother of Huitzilopochtli, the patron god of the Aztec Empire and a fearsome deity of war. We can learn a lot about what she represented to the Aztecs by exploring the imagery they carved into her. Starting with her head, which has been replaced by 2 facing serpents, giving her 2 faces, front and back, which speaks to the cyclical nature of time, like the Greek god Janus. Mixed with the snake imagery, it's also reminiscent of the Ouroboros, a symbol originating in ancient Egypt, which again represents cyclical renewal. At her neckline is this row of blood droplets, indicating the wound from her decapitation. Her arms have also been cut off and replaced by serpents, this time facing forward and ready to attack. In Mesoamerican art, writhing serpents often also represent flowing blood. Her flaccid breasts and belly rolls, which we'll get a better picture of later, denote the body of a mother, someone who has given birth. She has a necklace of human hearts and human hands, representative of sacrifice, literal and spiritual. And her belt is made up of interwoven snakes, hence her name. It's her most recognizable feature. And the rattlesnake is also a symbol of rain, their sound being associated with the supplication for rain, which is also cyclical and regenerative, like she is. Her feet and legs are made of talons, probably eagle, which were very important to the Aztecs due to its place in the origin of Tenochtitlan, the capital and founding city of the empire. And the eagle, of course, remains a major symbol of Mexico, and it's at the center of their national flag. And this isn't even the full effect. Originally, she would have been painted and decorated with precious stones. In the next slide, I'll talk about the history of this sculpture and how, despite being just a piece of stone, this Coatlicue maintained a monumental symbolic importance to Mexico, despite the Spanish conquest, through Mexican independence, and then finally, after the Mexican Revolution, was recognized as a foundational piece of Mexican art. It's thought that at the time of the conquest in the 1500s, Coatlicue, along with several other monumental religious sculptures, were buried for their protection. 270 years later, in 1790, this sculpture was discovered by accident and briefly put on display. However, she attracted far too much attention for the comfort of the Catholic Church. Bishop Benito Maria Mocho y Francoli explained at the time, quote, "The Indians, who look with such stupid indifference at all of the monuments of European arts, came with restless curiosity to contemplate their famous statue. The Indians surprised some on their knees, others prostrate, in front of that statue, and holding burning candles or some of the various offerings which their elders used to present to their idols." End quote. And it was determined that this newly rediscovered goddess was too great a threat to the souls of converted Indians, and thus a threat to the Spanish and Catholic power structure, and so she was reburied. In 1803, a European scholar requested to study her, and she was dug up again. Similarly, a cast was made for a businessman to take on tour in England. But the powers that be found her a satanic and immoral influence on Mexican audiences, and so she was reburied each time. I think it's fitting that this goddess of the earth was constantly returned to it. And only in 1823, with a rise in interest in the indigenous past that came along with Mexico's recent independence from Spain, was Coatlicue finally and permanently put on display. Now she's housed in Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology and is recognized as a keystone piece of Mexican art and culture. This illustration was from that first discovery and is by a scholar called Antonio Leon y Gama. Note how all the sides, including the base, are carved. The underside of this massive statue, 3 tons remember, would obviously be rarely seen, so the effort to carve this in was purely for symbolic and religious purposes. There's some disagreement as to who this figure is, but most say it's Coatlicue, who is another semi-gender fluid earth goddess. She's in what's called the birth-giving pose. And notice the double faces. This is the front face here, and she has the same face here, that dual face. And you can kind of see the little belly rolls, and she's kind of motherly figured. But this was not always Rivera's go-to goddess. Another archetype that Diego Rivera explored, along with other artists, was woman as earth, as generous woman of bounty. See next slide. Of course, it's not unusual to use the female body as a stand-in for the earth, ideals, or a nation. We're all familiar with the likes of Eugene Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, for instance. If the image doesn't come to mind immediately, there's a link in the audio transcripts there at the side. In fact, the more classical figure of Mother Earth or goddess is a very common motif in Rivera's work as well as with other Mexican artists. After all, Mexico is called La Madre Patria, the motherland. In his earlier work decorating the chapel of the Autonomous University of Chapingo, Rivera uses his second wife as the titular liberated earth with the natural forces controlled by man, 1926. Here we see model and writer Guadalupe Marin posing as an Earth Mother archetype, and if you notice, she is posing herself in the shape of Mexico as it appears on a map. See, here is the upper border. Her arm is kind of like Baja California. Then her ankles are the isthmus. There you go. Marin was actually pregnant in this portrait, adding to the sense of fecundity. And it's notable that she's at the pinnacle of what was the altar of the chapel, and her belly is basically at the center of it. Here and in the next slide, we see how woman is construed as a mother of bounty, but she is also represented as a passive and as an idealized vessel, while man is thought of and represented as an active agent of his destiny. For instance, the natural forces are controlled by man, whereas the female element is just the earth itself. In that sense, Coatlicue is definitely a different archetype as compared to the Mother Earth principle above. Coatlicue is destructive and creative, thus dualistic, as well as an aggressive and active figure. Here we have some more examples of a Mother Earth type figure representing a specific land. On the left, we see Diego Rivera's first mural in the US, entitled Allegory of California, created in 1931. The model was professional tennis player Helen Moody Wells as the mythical Amazonian queen Califia or Calafia. You might be able to tell Califia is where California gets its name. Rivera said of the piece, quote, California itself is symbolized by a large female figure, a woman of tan skin and opulent curves, modeled after the rolling hills of the landscape, with one hand offering the subsoil to the labor of the miners, and with the other offering the ripe fruits of the earth, end quote. Like Lupe Marin in the previous slide, Mills plays a more classic version of the Earth Goddess, with her open offering arms and her necklace of gold wheat. Rivera chose Mills as model because he found her to be the typical, quote, modern American girl. Mills was self-assured, confident, and independent. That she was an athlete added to the sense of strength and was a motif in Pan-American unity as well. I'll discuss this more down the line when I present champion diver Helen Krillinkovich. On the right, we see La Malinche, a very remarkable and enigmatic character in Mexican history. Often described as both a traitor and the mother of the Mexican people, she was part of a group of female slaves gifted by the Maya to Hernan Cortes and his men at the time of the Spanish conquest of Mexico. Because she spoke multiple languages and had incredible diplomatic skill and knowledge, she soon became instrumental to the conquest. Later, she would bear a son with Cortes, Martin. And while it's doubtful that he was literally the first mestizo, Martin's birth symbolically marks the beginning of the racial mixture that is core to Mexican identity. We're going to explore both these versions of a national maternal archetype, the indigenous mother of mestizo Mexico and the modern American girl who was bright, energetic, and generous. But first, let's just learn a little bit more about Malinche. Here we have two artistic representations of Malinche which show the range with which she is depicted. On the left is a page from a 16th century book detailing the history of the Tlaxcalans, an indigenous group who allied with the Spanish against the Aztecs. Malinche is the one on the right, pointing. Particularly in works by contemporary indigenous artists, Malinche is often depicted as someone who was as important or even more important to the conquest as Cortes himself. Note here how she is the larger and more active figure. The right is a fresco by one of the big three of the Mexican Muralist movement, Jose Clemente Orozco. It's a very different picture, which highlights the violent power imbalance between the conqueror and the conquered. Malinche here is much more passive, eyes downcast, being held and held back by Cortes. He steps on the body of another Indian whom Malinche can't protect. La Malenche doesn't make an appearance in our Pan-American mural directly, but it's important to point out that this idea that Mexico is a product of an indigenous mother and a European father predates Rivera. We'll talk more about this theme of Mexico's indigenous mother, but for the moment, let's return to Rivera's use of the female athlete. In Pan-American unity, this role is taken by champion diver Helen Crlenkovich. Like with Helen Moody Wills in Allegory of California, the Norse modernity in Pan-American unity is represented by a strong, athletic woman. Helen Krillinkovich was national springboard diving champion and a local celebrity here in San Francisco. She was set to go to the 1940 and 1944 Olympics, but unfortunately, both were canceled due to the Second World War. She embodies the modern woman in full possession of her body. She's athletic, active, and quite majestic. You can see that she's a very important element of the mural and is featured twice, here and here. She also adds a wonderful sense of movement and energy. Krillinkovich was also a student at City College, which was then San Francisco Junior College, and was the first woman to receive her pilot's license here. So like Coatlicue, she too embodies duality, that of air and water. The next slide is just going to be a couple photos of Helen Krillinkovich, and then following that, we're going to talk about how she fits into this idea of the modern American girl, or the new woman of the early 20th century. One of Krillinkovich's appearances is in panel 4. According to Rivera, the theme of this panel included the emancipation of women. However, the title includes the phrase, the rise of woman in various fields of creative endeavor through her use of the power of man-made machinery. It's a bit sexist and reveals the mores of the time. Rivera assigns action and domination of the female sphere to man, as he does with the chapel at Chapingo. In the top panel, we see different archetypes of that modernistic and emancipated new woman associated with the North. We see Paulette Goddard in her starring role in The Great Dictator. She's here a few times from a few different scenes. There's also this lady architect. What's particularly interesting about the architect is it's one area where you can see where Rivera has changed his mind. Her right foot juts forward and brings out her hip a bit, giving her an attitude that denotes sassy confidence. The change is noticeable because you can clearly see this man's right foot behind hers. So he had obviously finished this figure first, decided to move her leg, and then just painted over his foot. You might have to zoom in to see that better. And then here is Emmylou Packard. This was Diego Rivera's first assistant on the project, and she was the only other person to have done a significant amount of painting on this mural. Let's just take a moment to meet Emmylou. On the left is Emmylou and Frida Kahlo in Mexico. She actually returned to Mexico and lived with Frida and Diego for a time after the completion of the mural. It's thanks to Emmylou Packard that we have so much information about the Pan American Unity mural, because she acted as sort of a secretary for the project in addition to her own work on the mural directly. She saved all of her papers, and after her death, copies were donated to City College. Actually, one of the really cool parts of the docent program was being able to visit the Posner Room, which is where the Diego Rivera collection is located. We got to see all the letters to and from the various artists, newspaper clippings, postcards and pamphlets from the fair, pictures, all kinds of stuff. I definitely got a sense of some of the deeper research that is possible outside of just books and articles. And even if you're not a docent, you can visit. Sometimes they have open days, or you can also make an appointment. The library website has more info, and I'll add it to the audio transcript there at the side. So Emmylou Packard is an important figure to this mural in terms of her contribution to it, but she also represents the female artists of the north of the continent. Packard is totally engrossed in her work, like the other modern American girls, the architect, the diver, and the actress. This is mirrored on the opposite side of the mural, with the various indigenous artisans and artists of the South, including Frida Kahlo, who's also at a canvas. In this mural, Mexico's counterpart to the modern American girls of panel 4 are the indigenous artisans in panels 1 to 3. They're dressed in traditional clothes and are all in the process of what Rivera called plastic creation. That is, the creation of physical things. In panel 2, elements from the past and present, we have these basket weavers, this elderly woman making paper mache dolls, and most prominently, a woman weaving on a backstrap loom tied to this tree. Then nearby, in panel 3, we have Frida Kahlo in her iconic traje de Tejuana. Notice next to her is this seated sculptress. She's modeled off of Nieves Orozco, who was a rather well-known model in the Mexican artistic community, especially for what was called at the time her strong Indian features. She was used by artists who were looking to expand the standard of beauty rather than rely on a purely European one. You'll notice she's wearing the same style of dress as Frida Kahlo, and they're both involved in creative endeavors. Both of these things are hallmarks of Zapotec women who are being celebrated here. And I know I've just thrown a lot of terms at you guys, Tijuana, Zapotec, and we're going to get to those. But I just want to point out here that the message is one of contrast. In the European and North American context, the sphere of woman was relegated almost entirely to the home and child rearing, up until the modern era. That wasn't so for the Zapotec people. Women were always involved in all kinds of work, just like the sculptress. Also, the celebration of woman as creatrix brings us back to Coatlicue and those jade calluses she had in her palm. Work is divine, creation is divine, and these marks on her hand show her to create not just passively with her body, like becoming the earth or in terms of pregnancy, but actively and consciously with her own hands. So while the modern American girl emancipates herself with new technologies and a modern way of thinking, the Mexican woman emancipates herself by returning back to an idealized nationalistic indigenous past. And that's how Rivera is categorizing these themes in the mural, and he's not the only one to do so. There's been a biased understanding of technology and science as more European and male, and indigenous cultures being stereotyped as closer to nature and feminized. And all of this is communicated largely by the clothing choices of the women in this side of the mural. We're going to talk more about the iconography of this particular dress, that of the Tejuana woman. But before there is even a dress, there's cloth. So let's first unpack the weaver. To really understand the context of the weaver, we're going to have to zoom out and look at the upper parts of panels 1 and 2. The panel we were looking at in the last slide is this one here. And then right above it, we have Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, being carved by artist Mardonio Magaña and his apprentice. The carving is happening in the contemporary era, but the feathers originate out of this temple, bringing the scene back through time. In the foreground of that temple, we have Quetzalcoatl in his human form, with a council of leaders. In the Aztec creation myth, Quetzalcoatl is the god who went down to the underworld to gather the bones with which the first men were made. Later, he gives mankind 5 gifts that they need to build civilization, including agriculture, astronomy, and architecture, which is what he's doing in this scene. And who is wrapped up in this serpent connecting the past and the present, but craftspeople involved in the very same processes as those in the contemporary era that we saw in the last slide? We had sculptors and carvers. And then most identical, we have this weaver here. And again, having this all wrapped up in the god's tail shows the divinity of work, but it also shows the continuation of culture, the passing of knowledge through craft, that learning from mother to daughter, father to son, master to apprentice, and on, connecting us today to the very beginning of time. And it's apt that weaving is chosen as one of the main symbols of this connection, because there is archaeological evidence that this exact type of loom, the backstrap loom, has been used in Mexico for at least the past 4,000 years. And it's still in use today. Even today, the Zapotec and the Maya are known for their textiles. Here are two images that speak to that continuation of culture, especially the continuation of textile making. On the left, we see a weaver illustrated in a 16th century codex. This is part of a larger illustration about a festival, so there's a lot of people doing all kinds of activities, but this lady is in the middle of it, just working away. A backstrap loom is called that because you hold the threads taut by sitting or leaning on a strap that goes around your back. And you have to sit in a particular position, which this woman is, as are the weavers in our mural. And in pre-Hispanic Mexico, weaving was so associated with women and womanhood that whenever a woman is depicted, like in a codex or other art, she's always depicted seated in this position. On the right, I chose a modern example of cloth that was made using a backstrap loom. And you see these little intricate designs, the rooster, a mermaid, a little man. All of those are woven into the fabric. And that intricacy is why this type of loom is still in use to this day. Because even though it's relatively simple technology, it allows for a lot of control and variation. Some techniques just weren't possible on the larger, more industrial standing looms the Spanish would bring over later. The importance of the textile arts in Mexican and Mesoamerican culture cannot be overstated. Different regions had different designs, styles, dyes, etc. And cloth was so valuable, it was used almost like a currency. Taxes and gifts to the temples or rulers would be paid in cloth, for instance. When a girl was born, a spindle would be put in her hand, and when she died, she would be buried with one. Girls would be taught from a young age how to spin and weave, and many would spend 1 to 4 years at a temple exclusively to learn advanced techniques. What you see above are pages from the Mendoza Codex from around 1541, detailing the instruction of boys versus girls. You can see that while the boys learn a variety of skills, the girls spend almost all their time spinning, and their final lesson is a seat at the loom. Next, let's return to Rivera'S mural and see how a similar education was given to the girls of the North American pioneer days. The generational feminine lineage of textile arts is mirrored on the North American side of the mural too. This is Sarah Gerstle shown teaching her young daughter on what is known as a sampler. It's a piece of cloth embroidered with various stitches, patterns, letters, or words in order to display or practice a range of techniques. Just like in Aztec society, in American colonial times, girls' education focused heavily on textiles, not just in terms of learning the skills, but samplers were like the era's composition notebooks. Young girls would stitch the alphabet as Gerstle does in the mural, or biblical passages, sayings, or family's genealogy, whatever, in order to memorize the information. I saw one that was a map of New York State with all the county borders, the rivers, and names stitched in. Girls would start making these from as early as age 6, and of course move up to more complicated and decorative stitches. The example on the right was done when Sarah Skillen was 14, and then they would often be framed and displayed by their families. So the addition of this scene in the panel showing the pioneer days in the American West is historically accurate, and Rivera is trying to communicate that that teaching of skills from one generation to the next is universal. It's something all peoples do. There's a spiritual element to weaving as well that's worth underlining. In the minds of Mesoamerican peoples, weaving worked as an analogy to the way in which the cosmos were organized. They believed that the world was an intricate composite of opposing forces, like the weft and weave of cloth. And the idea of uniting opposing forces is a major theme of our mural, and much of Rivera's work in general. Even in English, we refer to the fabric of space and time. So this is a cross-cultural concept if you think about it. Like with the myth of Quetzalcoatl giving mankind his 5 gifts, there were parallel gifts given to womankind. This included knowledge of the plants for medicine, midwifery, of course, but also spinning and weaving. In one version of the myth, Xochiquetzal, who's pictured right, is the one to teach women how to spin and weave. She's the goddess of beauty, sexuality, pregnancy, and fertility. She's associated with nice clothes in general, but spinning is also related to her connection to pregnancy. As more thread is added to the spindle, it grows rounder like a pregnant belly. And weaving is given importance in at least one version of the Aztec myth on the origin of man. In this version, the gods' first orders are to womankind. Quote, "It was ordered that she spin and weave and that they give birth to Masehuales, people, and that they not be idle but always work." End quote. What you see here is a triptych of goddesses reminiscent of the Western version of the crone, the mother, and the maiden. And this is pre-contact. We don't have an exact date, but this image is from before the Spanish arrived, lending some credence to Jung's idea that these archetypes are somewhat universal. In addition to Xochiquetzal as the maiden, we have Tlazolteotl as the mother, who is shown with a spool and thread. She and Itzpapalotl, who at the left is evocative of the crone, are patrons of miscarriages and child mortality. There could also be some analogy between the cord of fibers and the umbilical cord, which I believe is also what the serpent represents. This one strangling the baby, indicating a problem in pregnancy. One last note on the weaver. People always mention how the tree she's working from looks like a woman's body, sort of stretching upwards with her arms raised. In my view, this directly relates to another fresco from a series we've already touched on. And I just want to point out the placement of the tree, which at first appears dead, but has this tiny sprouting of life. And if you step back, you see that the trunk lines up perfectly with the tree that Rivera is painting, the Liberty Tree, with the Pan American national heroes shaking hands in front. This scene, I think, speaks to Rivera's thoughts on his role as an artist. You know, he's painting this utopic vision, but it's the people below who turn it into reality, bring it to life. But it also links it to another of those frescoes that adorn the walls of the chapel at Chapingo, which we'll see in the next slide. This is Germination from the east wall of the chapel at Chapingo, and you can see this sort of plant-woman hybrid. Elsewhere in the series, there's another panel, which isn't pictured here, called The Blood of the Revolutionary Martyrs Fertilizing the Earth. And so the idea is that the sacrifice of these martyrs feeds the seeds of revolution, represented by the female figure, and eventually grows into the liberated earth, which is at the chapel's altar. That's the image we saw earlier featuring Lube Marin. So the concept of the feminine principle of growth is associated with the tree and germination. And similarly, in our mural, we have this quote, which reads in part, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." And so our tree fills the same role as the female body in germination, that of a symbolic growth of revolution nurtured by the blood of martyrs, this time Pan American. And now let's return to the iconization of that dress that Frida wears, which is known as El Traje de Tejuana. Here again is Frida Kahlo from the center panel, and two representations of almost the exact same dress. I wasn't trying at all to get such similar styles, but it just goes to show how ubiquitous this imagery was to Mexican art of the time. On the left, we have a poster printed by the Mexican National Graphics Workshop, probably in the 1950s. And on the right, we have a painting by Miguel Covarrubias dated around 1946. We're going to see even more instances of this dress or this woman as an icon, and the Tejuana could even be considered the Mexican national feminine archetype of this period. But let me backtrack. What is a Tejuana? Well, Tejuana means a woman from Tehuantepec, which is a city in southern Mexico. And the Isthmus of Tehuantepec is the area of Mexico where the land is most narrow. And this region is home to the Zapotec people. Their costume is identifiable by the huipil, which is used for the tops of both of these examples, paired with a long skirt, often with these pleated lace flounces you see on all three of these. A huipil is just a square top or dress or tunic with holes for a head and arms. And as I mentioned earlier, the bulk of the work in terms of fashioning clothes really goes into the sophisticated weaving of the textile or its embroidery, so the construction of the dress can often be much more simplified. The woman in the poster also wears this headdress, which is called a resplandor, which translates to resplendent. And it actually looked like her top has inset sleeves, which makes this more of a blouse than a huipil, and is a Spanish influence on the construction of the garment. And that's what's really interesting about the symbology of this dress. Despite the attempt at indigenous authenticity, it's actually heavily influenced by European fashions, particularly of the Victorian era. So how exactly did this one outfit become so iconic in Mexican art? Why does it reappear so much? And what does it represent? For one, and rather obviously, this dress style is mostly indigenous, so it's homegrown and thus uniquely Mexican. After the success of the Mexican Revolution, which lasted from 1910 to 1920, there was a big push by the government to create a cohesive national identity with the new revolutionary values. This was the reason for the Mexican Muralist movement in the first place. Murals were a perfect vehicle to share new communal ideas and national myths to the masses. There was at least an attempt to incorporate the indigenous population and recognize that the vast majority of Mexicans have some indigenous heritage. What you see here was one of Rivera's earliest murals in the 1920s that he painted right after a trip to the Tehuantepec region. Jose Vasconcelos, who was then Minister for Education, was the one who commissioned the first public murals, thereby helping to start the Mexican muralist movement. And he was disappointed with how European Rivera's first artistic attempts looked. So he sent Rivera to the Tehuantepec region, promising a tropical indigenous paradise with beautiful women who would inspire him. And it did, as it had with many other artists. Despite being part of the same country, the Tehuantepec region exuded a peculiar sense of exoticism in the minds of upper-class Mexicans, particularly Euro-identified men, which Rivera was in some ways. He'd spent the entirety of the Mexican Revolution in Europe and had studied under some of the biggest European artists of the era. Miguel Covarrubias called the Isthmus of Tehuantepec the Bali of Mexico, and Professor Sophie Touzé at City College refers to it as the Tahiti of Mexico. The region was associated with the images of languid women in the tropical heat and reinforced the idea that Tejuana women were sultry vixens in a hot, steaming Garden of Eden. Many of the images of Tejuanas were exoticized in the same way that Gauguin the French post-impressionists, would exoticize and eroticize Native women from the South Pacific in the 1800s. Another myth about the Zapotecs is that they were organized in a matriarchal society. And while it's true that the Zapotecs were and are pretty egalitarian, and that women participate fully in public life, such as running the markets and administering public affairs, reports of a matriarchy where sexually free women ruled over meek men were greatly exaggerated. The Tehuantepec region was more so matrilocal, not matriarchal. And again, if you're not familiar with those terms, there's some links in the audio transcript. But this exoticization of the Tejuanas was not formed out of thin air. The Mexican state played a large role in the promotion of the Tejuana as a national icon. And that's why we see her so much in government commissioned works. However, it must be said that this phenomenon was activated by women, from production to marketing to popularization of the Tejuana dress. Even some of the contradictions were because of a specific woman in particular. We'll meet her in the next slide. Ironically, the creation of the Tejuana and her clothing as a national symbol had started long before the Mexican Revolution, under the administration of Porfirio Diaz, the military man shown left. He was the very dictator that the revolutionaries would overthrow by 1911. He and other elite Mexicans sought to tap into what was perceived as the nobility of some Mexican indigenous cultures. And the Zapotec's level of artistic sophistication was deemed civilized enough to add to the national heritage by an otherwise very elitist and Euro-identified government that routinely victimized and despised real indigenous people. Furthermore, the traditional Tejuana dress was heavily influenced by the fashions of Victorian Europe, particularly due to the work and influence of the woman we see here on the right. This is Juana Catarina Romero. She was a mestiza woman of Zapotec descent, who started off selling hand-rolled cigarettes on the street and grew into a hugely influential businesswoman, focusing largely on textile imports and sales. She would radically alter the fashion of the region for over a century. And you'll notice she herself is not wearing her traditional outfit. Juana Catarina Romero was a lifelong friend of Porfirio Diaz and ascribed to some similar beliefs regarding modernity and civilized society. She aspired to be upper class, to create a consumer class out of her indigenous community, and believed in the more stringent sexual mores of the Victorian society. She was basically the exact opposite of what Tejuanas are stereotyped as. So while Romero promoted the Tehuantepec national ideal and did wear the traditional costume on special occasions, she had decidedly European tastes as well. So let's look at what the traje was like before such heavily European-inspired changes. Just before the turn of the 20th century, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec was one of the most diverse regions in Mexico. Of course, there were the various peoples who had lived there all along, but before the building of the Panama Canal, it was also a hub of traders looking to travel from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Romero used her connections with both her indigenous community, which was already famous for their style, and an international network of merchants to create a textile empire. She imported lace from Holland for the flounces, black velvet from England, the latest fashions from Paris, embroidery techniques from China, and of course, Singer sewing machines from the United States. And all these things brought new possibilities to the seamstresses of the Isthmus. And since Romero was a firm believer in modesty, she also incorporated Victorian mores into the costume. We can see from much earlier drawings these changes. On the left is a page from Codex Vaticanus 3738, written around the conquest. It details many of the costumes of the different peoples and classes of Mexico. We see the huipil, of course, And notice how the skirt is just a tube, maybe just a rectangular piece of cloth wrapped around. On the right is a page from a similar 19th century book detailing Mexican costumes by Claudio Linati. The sheerness of this resplandor is a bit exaggerated, and Linati is clearly sexualizing the independent-minded Tejuana woman, just as Gauguin, the French post-impressionist, would emphasize the languid sensuality of the Tahitian women. However, under Guanacaste, skirts were made longer and fuller, thus more modest within the prudish context of the times, and no longer were breathable sheer fabrics or crop tops acceptable. But funnily enough, it was these changes that made this type of dress more palatable to other segments of society. Next, let's follow that Mexican national feminine archetype and how it found its way into movies and popular culture. By the 1920s, women of all classes were donning Tejuana dress as both a fashion and political statement. With the changes to and commodification of the traje discussed in the previous slide, mestiza women of the middle and upper classes felt comfortable participating in at least this aspect of indigenous culture. Thus, they appropriated the indigenous fashion and repurposed it. And like with the rediscovery of Coatlicue right before independence, the donning of a uniquely Mexican dress fed the nationalistic mindset of post-revolution Mexico. Both top images are movie stills, and they show how Mexican actresses of the golden age of Mexican cinema, which was from the 1930s to the 1950s, also flaunted that Mexican national feminine archetype. In the photograph of Maria Felix right, we see the now classic embroidered black velvet top and skirt, introduced from England by the likes of Guanacaste. The full reasons for Frida Kahlo's choice to wear indigenous clothing are not known. No doubt her lifelong commitment to the causes of the Mexican Revolution was one, but it also might have been her desire to please her husband, Diego Rivera, or she might have favored the long, comfortable skirts to cover her various injuries. Whatever the reasons, the dress itself was appropriated from indigenous culture and was thus culturally disembodied, but still became an important feature of her personality and her work. Kahlo famously wore nothing else in the United States, making the politics of her choice very clear. She's proud to be Mexican and is especially glad to show off her culture in a land that has historically bullied its weaker neighbor. Here's a portrait of Kahlo looking confident, nonchalant, and strong in her traje amid the skyscrapers of New York City's skyline. So as we see, archetypes are collectively constructed and nourished. This is done in many ways, whether through fashion or varied representations of women in art. But let's get back to the mural and get a little bit more specific and look at how Diego Rivera uses Frida Kahlo as an icon and as a symbol in Pan-American unity. In the mural, Kahlo stands as a real person, but also as a character. Like Coatlicue, she personifies many of the mural's themes and plays various roles. She is, of course, Rivera's wife, well, ex-wife at this particular time, but we'll get back to that. She's also represented as one of the great artistic producers of the south of the continent. So she's a generative mother, not of children, but of art. And she's portrayed as an easel painter, which is associated with the European tradition of high art, just as Rivera's style is a fusion of French and Mexican artistic training. Also, Frida is a mestiza herself, as she had a Mexican mother and a Hungarian-born father, thereby an example of this cultural mixing that Rivera is promoting in Pan-American unity. And as we've been discussing, she's also an icon of the new post-revolutionary Mexico, which is the Tijuana. And in this final row, she is juxtaposed with architect Timothy Pfluger in his suit and tie, the costume of the powerful American male, which contrasts sharply with Frida's dress. Yet the resonant theme of this mural was precisely to blend these two disparate parts, Indigenous Mexico and Yankee US, into a stronger Pan-American whole. Rivera has used the same juxtaposition in a much earlier fresco in Mexico, though the message of that mural was quite different. Here we see a detail of Diego Rivera's Ministry of Education mural that was created in the late 1920s, long before the Pan American Unity mural. And here his choice of composition visually demonstrates the symbolism of the Euro-identified rich socialites versus the strong, warm, working-class indigenous woman. In Our Bread on the right, Rivera invokes the icon of the Tejuana as a foil to the order dominated by patriarchal, Eurocentric, capitalistic-minded men. Whereas before the ruling class of Mexico strived to be European, as on the left, now that the revolution had succeeded, Mexico was assumedly proud of its indigenidad, indigenousness, which was an idea promoted by the likes of Education Minister Jose Vasconcelos and Diego Rivera. Thus, this mural depicts a propagandistic return to idyllic indigenous past that was mythologized to be more communal, more matriarchal, and closer to nature. And in Pan American Unity, Rivera attempts to bridge that divide through the union of North and South. But let's move from the political to the personal and look into Rivera's personal views on women, which were complicated to say the least. I think if you asked Rivera, he would say he was pro-woman. At least professionally, he had a lot of respect for women. He often worked with female artists and strongly promoted them, most of all Frida Kahlo. But he was also a notorious womanizer, which caused problems in all three of his marriages and with several of his assistants. If you take any credence to Jungian psychology, this could have been rooted in the dissatisfaction he had with the relationship with his own mother, who he regarded as quite distant and cold. So he struggled with a mental and emotional image of that dualistic great and terrible mother, the two aspects of Coatlicue. At any rate, his relationship with women was complex. As mentioned earlier, he and Frida were divorced during the entire production of this mural, though she was always a key feature of both the mural and Rivera's life. However, only about 2 months before his arrival in San Francisco, Rivera met Paulette Goddard, and she became his latest infatuation. She was added by him to the mural's center panel almost last. In the mural, Goddard is dressed in white, representing an angelic, idealized, even virginal woman. She and Rivera are planting a ceiba tree, the Mayan tree of life, surrounded by roots and accompanied by two children, all playing happy family lifestyles, and representing the marriage of the North and South. In front of them stands Frida, who could not have children and who had suffered several miscarriages. Still, she was a creative force in her own right and is about to embark on a creative journey at her blank canvas. She also filled a sort of motherly role to Rivera, and he actually places a self-portrait of himself as a child behind her skirts, pictured in the previous slide. Next, we'll take a look at some of Kahlo's own work from this trip to San Francisco. Left is a self-portrait by Frida Kahlo, which was painted here in San Francisco at the same time that Rivera was working on the mural. Despite their divorce, Frida followed Diego to San Francisco after the assassination of friend and comrade Leon Trotsky, who had been in Mexico at the behest of Rivera. The trauma surrounding the event exacerbated her many health problems, and so when she arrived, she immediately checked into St. Luke's Hospital under the care of her friend and doctor, Leo Eloesser, to whom this painting was dedicated. Note here the allusions to Coatlicue with the thorn necklace, which draws blood at her neckline like the statue with her severed head. Her earrings, which are the shape of human hands, mimic Coatlicue's adornment. Those earrings were actually a gift from Pablo Picasso, and we can see her wearing them in our mural as well, along with the skull necklace, which is also like Coatlicue's. And I just love this close-up of a massive serpent right by Kahlo's head that leaves her totally unbothered. Thus in the mural, Kahlo was personified as a sort of archetypal goddess too. In the next slide, we'll briefly talk about North America's missing Indigenous mother. We have established that in the popular national imagination, Mexico is the offspring of an Indigenous mother and a Spanish father. But in the United States, there is no such mixing, mestizaje, only wholesale rejection and decimation of the Native American populations by people originating in Europe. Rivera alludes to this fractured relationship with the native persons toiling slave-like at the wheel here, and with the caricature of the cigar store Indian. What's more, the destruction of man in panel 5 is accompanied with the destruction of the land, with the cavernous scars of the Shasta Dam and the chopping down of the great redwoods. Despite his obvious admiration for the great machines, industry, and technological advancement of the North, which as we've discussed he aligns with the male sphere, Rivera warns that without the balance of the female sphere, nature, community, spirituality, and creativity, the North might face self-annihilation. So Rivera offers an alternative, an adopted mother, Coatlicue, in whose very body space has been made for this new element. By transforming half her body into the cold, unfeeling machine, Rivera offers a vision of synthesis between the US and Mexico, the ancient and the modern, science and spirituality, life and death, so that the continent and people upon her might be made into a stronger whole. And with that, we've at least touched on all the panels by looking deeply into the female archetypes. To do justice to this mural is a huge feat. As you can tell, it's an enormous complex piece, and there's so much more to learn. My approach was to take one theme and expand on it, but you could do that with any number of topics. You could look at the Masonic imagery in it, just the composition of the piece, politics, history, anything really. So I hope I've piqued your interest. If you want to learn any more, all my sources are listed left, and they're all accessible either through the CCSF Library or San Francisco Public Library. And if you haven't seen the mural in person, then definitely do so. Try to see it either at SF MoMA or when it's back on campus, because there's really no comparison. And maybe even consider joining the docent program. It's a really great program, and I've learned a lot from it. Special thanks to Professor Touzé for guiding me through this project. She spent a lot of time with me on this, editing, giving really great ideas, and just generally turning it into a cohesive piece. Also, thanks to Nicole Ost, the docent coordinator, for even suggesting this project and her edits as well. She's really made the docent program all it can be. We're very lucky to have such amazing teachers with great energy here at City College. All right, thanks everybody for joining me.